Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Patterson. I'm the board chair for Caminar. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Caminar Speaker Series, Revolutionizing Behavioral Healthcare. The series aspires to disrupt traditional thinking and deepen our collective knowledge, practices, and understanding to improve the well-being of the whole community. Today's presentation centers on putting racial equity at the heart of mental well-being. For those who are new to Caminar, we are a San Francisco-based, Northern California, mission-driven healthcare organization that serves thousands of youth, families, and adults each year. Caminar is dedicated to support and empower individuals and families to move forward to resilience, wellness, and independence. Today's program is possible through the generous support of our sponsors, Kathy and Michael Chin, Hanson Crawford Crum, the 49ers, Linda and Richard Leao, Stanford Healthcare, Ted's Village Pharmacy, Patty and John Bentley, Kaiser Permanente, Peninsula Healthcare District, Scott and Shelley Taylor, Krista Krames, and Clayton Peters. And also our media sponsors, San Francisco Business Times, Silicon Valley Business Journal, the San Mateo Daily Journal. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of Caminar's Board of Directors and the Advisory Committee to personally express my gratitude for their contributions throughout the year. If you'd like to make a contribution please visit www.caminar.org to support the compassionate, skilled care that Caminar provides to treat individuals with complex mental health and substance use treatment needs to reduce family suffering and improve our communities. Please follow us on social media to stay connected. With that, I'm excited to introduce Caminar's CEO, Mark Cloutier.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Kenneth V. I first met Ken when we were both presenting at a conference on adverse childhood experiences in Bermuda 3 years ago. Ken is a clinician, organizational consultant, and director of the Eikenberg Institute for Relationships in New York, and is a prominent thought leader in the field of psychology. His work focuses on mental health, trauma, oppression, and the role of racism in mental health. He has a book coming out on May 17th titled The Enduring, Invisible, and Ubiquitous Centrality of Whiteness. Dr. Hardy is a frequent conference speaker and has also appeared on ABC's 2020, Dateline NBC, PBS, and the Oprah Winfrey Show. We are thrilled to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ken Hardy.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank everyone for being in attendance today. I can honestly say that I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, and I know that I do this for a living, so I know the politically correct thing to say is I'm delighted to be here, even if I felt miserably about being here. That is not the case today. This topic area is one that is near and dear to my own heart. It's literally on the street where I live. And so I feel extraordinarily honored and privileged to be here with all of you today. I don't think any one of us here needs to be reminded that that just a little bit less than 2 years ago, that our nation and the world were stunned by the brutal, senseless, and inhumane murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and actually countless others that are too numerous to name here. But it was the murder of George Floyd in broad daylight, on camera, with the world watching, that reinforced and reaffirmed what many Black and brown people have always known, and what many white people, unfortunately, have worked really hard to either ignore or deny. And that is that Black and brown bodies have historically been objectified in our country and treated as if somehow they were somewhere between subhuman and non-human. While all this is erupting, as so many of us can never forget, and disrupting the prevailing order in the midst of a global pandemic, no less, with the country hopelessly polarized regarding whether to wear a mask or not wear a mask. The George Floyd murder did at least resolve one mask-related issue, and that was that the mask that had been worn by this country, designed to deny and dismiss the vicious and ugly face of racism, had been aggressively removed, and perhaps forever. It made it hard to deny the ever-threatening realities of what it means to be a person of color in this land of the free. At last, this time, it was even too gruesome, too grotesque, and too brutally inhumane for even whites who often proclaim to be colorblind were forced to see and come to terms with the fact that people of color and white people in our society do in fact live in two separate and unequal worlds. As we all poignantly remember, in the midst of shock and shame, rage and outrage, virtually all areas of our society vowed to do better, to make racial equity prominent and white supremacist ideology passé. In the spirit of this resolve, we watched Aunt Jemima be removed from the pancake box, although I wondered what took so long. White people discover Juneteenth and the recognition of it as a holiday, 3 centuries following slavery, I might add. Financial institutions, colleges and universities, state legislators, and many other organizations and institutions finally found it within themselves to apologize for the brutality of slavery. And though payment of the 40 acres of the mule remain sort of in your arrears when you think about it, but the likes of Nike, Google, JP Morgan Chase, American Express, and other prominent companies donated $50 billion to a myriad of Black organizations, and yet many of them financially benefiting from the very funds they donated. So here we are, less than 2 years, and it seems timely and appropriate for us to get a pulse read, to see where we are. Where are we individually, collectively, and institutionally? Has the racial reckoning that was promised and so many of us were looking forward to lived up to its advanced billing? Or is it, or has it been yet another dream deferred? Has it maintained its energy and its focus? Or has it contributed to conflicts and chasms in our relationships, especially our cross-racial relationships? The reckoning seems to have awakened the spirit of several groups of people among us. So there are some of us who remain hopeful, but doubtful that anything will change. There's some of us who are hopelessly disillusioned, convincing that things will never change. Yet there's some of us who cling on to hope and remain frustrated and fatigued. And then finally, hopefully, a relatively small number of us who believe that, who are among the resolved, who believe that, well, the way it is, unfortunately, is the way it is. So I think the critical questions that each of us must ask ourselves at this critical juncture is, what is my role? What is my role as a citizen of the planet? What is my role as a leader, a CEO, a board director, president, chairman of a board? And what is it incumbent upon me to do at this critical moment? And so I think that we have been actually engaged in this process of trying to uplift racial equity within organizations and institutions. I happen to believe that the task before us is one that both individuals and institutions share. So I want to take my time here to outline what I believe are 10 critical steps that both individuals and institutions must consider, but actually must take an active role in order to be able to advance the cause of racial equity. So the first is, I know that in our zest and zeal to change the prevailing order, that all of us start thinking critically about what is it that I need to do? What is it that we can do? What is it that should be done? And I think those are critical questions to ask. We should be concerned about what we might do. But I do worry, in much the same way that I worried right after the George Floyd murder, that I heard in any number of settings, in corporations, in boardrooms, in therapy sessions, we have to talk about race. We have to talk about race. This is in response to George Floyd. And there was a part of me that was delighted to hear that, and yet a part of me that was quite worried because I didn't think we were at a place where we could effectively talk about race. So I think the first step that each of us has to engage in, be it individual and or institution, is to engage in a process of seeing, being, and doing, and recognizing the interrelationship between those three. I think that it makes sense that we would want to do. I don't trust, though, that we can actually effectively do the doing until we have engaged in the seeing and the being. And so the seeing really speaks to our ability to look at the world we've always looked at and dare to see it differently, to be able to see it through the prism of race. That's what the seeing means. Seeing means that we're able to see all the intricate, intimate, and nuanced ways in which race is so delicately integrated into every fabric of our society. Some of us can see that with a bit more clarity than others, but I think in order to move the needle, that we all have to enhance our ability to see. And once we upgrade our seeing, if you will, it paves the way to then engage in a process of doing. And being. And being is a kind of existential inquiry. It's the me when I'm asking myself the very difficult questions about myself. It's where I endeavor to be honest with myself about myself with regard to my understanding about race. I believe it's only once we've done the seeing and the being can we, in an effective, wholehearted way, engage in the doing. All too often, some of us engage precipitously in the doing to our demise and to a lack of substantive progress. The second step is, I think, that the seeing, being, and doing paves the way for each of us individually and institutionally to engage in a process of self-examination, self-interrogation, and self-reflection. So what you're essentially hearing from me is the work around racial equity actually starts with the inside out. It's inside the individual out. It's inside the institution out, which is actually the exact opposite often of how we approach this work. So the self-examination is really trying to understand myself and my institution through the lens of race. That's the first step. Self-interrogation are all the critical questions we ask ourselves about what are the ways in which I individually or we institutionally have turned a blind eye toward race. What are the ways in which we implicitly, unconsciously collude with white supremacist ideology? That these are really difficult questions to ask of oneself, but I think they're absolutely essential that we do. And then the final question is piece around self-reflection is now that I see what I have been unable to see, and now that I'm entertaining aspects of myself, both individually and institutionally, that I've never had to sort of think about before, what do I do? What is my responsibility? And so what I think this means is that for individuals and for institutions, that we should need to figure out, where do we fit on this continuum around race? I believe there are four possible stations. I think the first is racial oblivion. And racial oblivion essentially means that I don't see the importance of race, that there's only one race, the human race. And so the 2022 version of this is, and therefore, all lives matter. So with racial oblivion, as the term would imply, there's an inability to see race or think critically about it. The second stage is racial awareness. And racial awareness, I might add, is often the curse of the white liberal. That racial awareness means that I have a cognitive understanding of race, that I may have some degree of proficiency in the language of race, that I have read some of the germinal works dealing with issues of race, and that racial awareness is really about what I believe, and what I know. But what racial awareness does not do, it does not propel one to act. And so, for the most part, racial awareness is a kind of cognitive intellectual process where I have an acute intellectual understanding of race, but it doesn't translate into what I do. I'll give you a short example of this. I was attending a business meeting of an association that I've been intimately involved in for years. And it was a public business meeting. This is obviously before the pandemic, in a large auditorium in a hotel with about 1,000 people in attendance. And the board holding this public meeting was debating about whether or not ex-felons who had done their time, had gone through a process of rehabilitation, had been trained as therapists, whether or not those individuals should be eligible for licensure as clinicians. So they were debating this issue. And as you might imagine, there were a variety of opinions about it. I'm sitting in the audience with two white colleagues, both of whom I've known for years, I've worked extensively with, who've done a lot of work in this area around racial sensitivity, racial equity. We've presented together, we've written together. But in the midst of this meeting, one of the board members in this public meeting said, at the apex of his frustration, if we don't pass this, if we don't allow ex-felons in, how the hell are we ever going to increase the number of black people we have in the organization? You people talk out of both sides of your mouth. On the one hand, you say you want more diversity, and here you're about to make a decision that will make it impossible for us to bring in more people of color. I was stunned when he said that, but I was even more shocked by the deafening silence in the room. I was probably one of 10 people of color, one of 2 black people in the room. It felt like a gut punch, but I remained. I sat. Only a few minutes later, another board member, perhaps expressing frustration, said publicly in the meeting, in the presence of these 1,000 people, I have to be honest with you folks here. I have to be honest with you. I'm beginning to feel like the N-word here. I feel like the N-word, except he said the word. I had heard as much as I was capable of hearing at that moment. I was feeling fury, just utter disappointment that this organization I'd given years of my life to voluntary labor. I also knew that I'd had the experience in my life of hearing something where I should have spoken and didn't speak, and aware of the kind of humiliation that comes with that for days after. So I finally stood up, convinced myself to stand up, nervous as hell. And I'm hearing all the voices of my parents in my head as I'm standing up. I'm thinking about all the racialized lessons that I received in my family growing up. I hear my mother saying, tone down the bass, Kenny. Tone down the bass. I hear my father saying, you can't express any affect with white people because your affect becomes the issue, not the clarity of your message. So I'm weighing all that as I stand up. I'm so nervous, I can literally feel my chin shivering. And I finally say, managing my bass, managing my affect, what it was like for me to sit there and hear those two disclosures. And I said, it makes me feel, reminds me that some of us are not as much members as others. It was disappointing for me to hear this from an organization that I love and that I've given so much to, and I'm profoundly disappointed. That was my message. That's not what I was feeling internally. I sat down. There was no acknowledgement that I had ever spoken, and the chairman of the board called on for the next comment. The meeting is over. I'm in the hallway, and my two white ultra-liberal colleagues are coming over to me to extol me. Oh, Ken, that was so great. That was so courageous of you. That was so brave. And you were so incredibly clear. And I was absolutely, absolutely furious. I can't even say here what I said to them because it was peppered with the most obscene profanity. I was enraged. And I said to them, yelling, you think I'm stupid? You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know what's happening here? And what I was referring to was that when we're in that meeting, they never said a word, never said a word, but privately want to come to me and assure me and reassure me of how brave I was. And I understood that while we're in the room, they protected the privilege they held in that room because they wouldn't be characterized as race obsessed or troublemakers in much the same way that I was characterized. But then privately, they want to make sure that they secure their positionality with me. I'm ashamed to say that is often my case, my experience with the white liberal, who is inundated with racial awareness, the knowledge, but doesn't transport to what they do. And so the next stage is racial sensitivity. And racial sensitivity is where one develops an affective understanding of race, not just an intellectual understanding, but an affective understanding, where one begins to anticipate other, where one begins to ask oneself about the experience of people of color before they're actually told, where one is experiencing their own whiteness and asking questions about, is curious about how it's impacting the interactions in which I'm interacting with. That's racial sensitivity. There's something about it that allows one to anticipate other, which I think then propels one to do. And then the final stage of this continuum is racial responsibility. And racial responsibility is where I feel compelled to take action vis-a-vis race, regardless of who's present, regardless of whom I'm meeting with, that I recognize that it's my responsibility to not do everything, but my responsibility to do something. So my point here is that I don't know that institutions or its leaders can advance its racial equity initiatives until one has some idea about where one falls on this continuum. I think that's important. The fourth step is I think that leaders within organizations have to be committed to changing not just the complexion of the organization, but also the culture. Neither is easy, but one is easier than the other. It is easier to find those qualified minorities, as we like to refer to them in some spaces, than it is to change the complexion, to change the culture of an organization. I think if one is serious about moving racial equity along within one's institutional structure, it requires a commitment to not just change the demographics of your organization, but also spend time thinking through the culture of that organization, how you might shift the culture. And let me suggest to you that having one person of color on your board of directors or one person of color in your executive leadership team is not a game changer. Because those people of color, when they're the only one, when there's a lack of a critical mass, voices essentially get silenced in those spaces. So it serves the optics very well. I don't know that it changed the underlying dynamics for the organization. So I think there has to be a willingness to do both. The fifth consideration is I think there has to be a willingness on the part of leadership within organizations to address the two most salient hidden factors that stifle the racial equity process within organizations. And those two factors are time and transparency. Time and transparency. As we all know, that time is a resource that can be used to enhance racial equity efforts, deter those racial equity efforts, or actually merely ensure the status quo. So it's worth looking at and thinking through, how is time allocated vis-a-vis this initiative? I think it was Joe Biden who said, don't tell me what you value, don't tell me what you believe, show me your budget. Well, I would like to add to that. Don't tell me what you value, don't tell me what you believe, show me your budget and how you spend your time. And so that this work requires sustainability. It's not a one-off, check the box. It means that one has to be perpetually committed to it. Because in some ways, the system, all of our systems have been constructed over centuries to in the way that they're structured and cannot be dismantled after one all-day workshop or one critical conversation about race. I think the work has to be sustainable. I work with a number of organizations that will do things like create space for a racial sensitivity training, but then not release staff from their duties. So the staff is conflicted between, do I attend this workshop or do I reach my quota for the week? And so again, that becomes an issue of time. Transparency is also another critical issue because in most organizations, and I would assume this would be true for many of you on this platform, that it is commonplace in our organizations that if you enter the sort of metaphorical basement of an organization, that's where you find the highest aggregation of people of color. And as you ascend up the metaphorical escalator, elevator, from the basement to the penthouse, that most organizations get whiter and whiter. And this is why transparency is such an issue. And so when one has proximity to decision making, when one has proximity to power, one has access to information. When I work with organizations throughout this country, one of the most salient criticisms that most people of color have is that they feel left out and locked out of what's happening within the organization, that their access to information is quite limited. And this is exacerbated by the fact that if there's any kind of structural ambiguity, that it is the confluence of structural ambiguity and the lack of transparency that leaves many staff of color feeling completely alienated within the context of their work. And so to me, transparency really, it ultimately is an issue of respect, of accountability, of empowerment, and that it allows for a unique kind of power sharing when an organization or its leadership can be transparent about its actions. The sixth step, I think is important, is that leadership has to take an active role in being the broker of permission. And I'll tell you what this means. I just assume, my assumption is that in this country, both in and outside of organizations, that we operate under a kind of metaphorical gag order when it comes to race, that we don't talk about it. And when we talk about it, we're awkward, we walk on eggshells. And what I'm suggesting is that it's very difficult to become an anti-racist organization, to advance racial equity, if within that organization there's a trepidation about having conversations about race. And so I think the extent to which conversations are held about race within an organization is within the province of leadership. And so I think that the leaders of the organization, the CEOs, the presidents, the board chairmen, have to really be the brokers of permission. And what that broker permission simply means is I'm giving you permission to have conversations about race here within the context of our organization. And no, it doesn't happen the way I just described it. It's not explicit that the leadership is granting the board of, is granting operating the broker permission by what one does. And so when leaders talk about race, it has a way of communicating to all the staff, the entire system, that this is a place, this is a setting, this is an institution where we can have meaningful, spirited conversations about race. And so I think that means that race has to be named. I think the leadership has to demonstrate both the will and the skill to navigate difficult conversations. And that involves even some use of self. So I think it's important for a white CEO to refer to himself or herself as a white CEO. It's odd, as one CEO once said to me, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard from a so-called educated person in my entire life. Why would I need to say I'm white when it's obvious I'm white? And I said, yes, it's obvious that you're white, but the reason you just say it is that you know you're white, I know you're white, and I need to know that you know you're white. That's the importance of saying it. The seventh step is I think that leadership and organizations must be committed to becoming racially informed, racially sensitive, racially responsible leaders. And I'll tell you what it means to be a racially sensitive, racially responsible leader. Because when you really think about it, none of us, myself and none of us, have been trained to run multiracial organizations or institutions. We all drink our water from the same well. We all have been trained to run white institutions. And so my thing is that whiteness is an ideology. I liken it to COVID. It infects and affects all of us. And why I think it's critical to talk about whiteness and deconstruct whiteness is one doesn't have to be white in order to be inundated and influenced by whiteness. And so it doesn't matter to me that the CEO is a person of color. It doesn't necessarily mean that that organization is still not organized by principles of whiteness, and the kind of critique I'm talking about actually should be in order. Because we don't have models for what it means to run and structure a multiracial organization. We know what it's like to run a white organization and have people of color accommodate, but we don't know how to create a multiracial organization. And so I think it's important for the racially informed, racially sensitive, racially responsible leader to see oneself as a racial being, to see oneself not just as a CEO, not just a person with an MBA or MPH or PhD, but also that someone is racialized in our society, and to have some sense about what that means and how I am perceived because of that. It also means that for the racially sensitive, racially informed, racially responsible leader, that one embraces one's power and privilege and not deny it. And so when one recognizes one power and embraces one power, one recognizes that to whom much is given, much is expected. So I realize that if I'm the person who holds the lion's share of the power and privilege in the organization, I have a greater responsibility because I have more power. And so that we have three choices the kinds of relationships we can cultivate with our power. We can deny it, in which case we abuse it. We can ignore it, in which case we misuse it. Or we can embrace it, and therefore which enables us to use it responsibly. I think we should be about thinking through how do we use our privilege responsibly. I also think that it's important for the racially responsible, racially sensitive, racially informed leader to recognize that if I have supervisory power, if I have those I supervise, it is absolutely important for me to develop supervision in order to do my supervision. And the supervision means that I'm committed to looking at those I supervise, as well as the context in which I'm embedded, in the following ways. It means I have begun to think culturally, which means I'm paying attention to these dimensions of diversity. It means I am thinking relationally, so I'm recognizing the importance of relationships. And thirdly, it means I am thinking contextually. And so I'm thinking about the ways in which my staff and my colleagues are impacted by not just the interior context of the workplace, but also how my staff and employees may be impacted by what's going on in the broader societal context as well. So it means that I'm constantly looking at the workplace through those three lenses. I think the ninth step is that it means that each of us in a leadership role should to make a concerted effort to ensure the sustainability of the work, to make sure that we're continuing to chip away at it, that the work is longitudinal. It's not a here today, gone tomorrow, and that we have to invest in that. And so one of the things I think it means in really concrete terms is that structurally we treat racial equity in the same way that we treat our finance department or our HR department or our IT department. As I mentioned in a talk yesterday to Mark's staff, you will not find an organization anywhere in this country that's absent a finance department, some form of HR, and IT. We see those as critical pillars of an organization. I think it's a three-legged chair that should be a four-legged chair. I think we should add racial and diversity and racial equity as that fourth leg, which means that we institutionalize it so that there's no decision that we make organizationally where someone or someone's aren't asking, how does this decision impact our racial equity goals? That someone has to ask that question to make sure that there's sustainability. And finally, the final step is I think that we have to be committed to understanding, interrogating, and dismantling whiteness as an ideology. And as I said, I think that ideology is a perspective that affects all of us. I know if it were not for, it was a 14-year-old Dominican boy sitting in a therapy session in Brooklyn, New York, who saved my life in some ways and saved my career. He was perplexed by me. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Doc, I don't get you." He said, I'm sitting here and I see the complexion, but I don't feel the connection." My immediate reaction was to push back. "You little snot, who asked you for your opinion?" I thought. But he was saying something profound to me. He was seeing an aspect of me that I had not seen. I had gone through all my years of education, graduated from my doctoral program, did 2 internships, 2 postdocs, and I had become a pretty decent, better than average white therapist. And that's what he was saying to me. And so I think it becomes critical for us to look at all the ways in which whiteness as an ideology, which is why I think it's just as important and perhaps even more important that we talk about whiteness than we do white people, because whiteness affects us all. And so I just think, in the interest of time, I'll just go through these very quickly, what I think are some of the pillars of white ideology embedded in our institutions. One, I don't know if whiteness is a producer of hierarchy, but I know there's a very compatible relationship between whiteness and hierarchy. And that this subscription to an hierarchical view of the world is very neatly entangled with whiteness. Just think about it. White hierarchy and whiteness even creates a hierarchy among white people. So that if you are white and Jewish, you're not as white as the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. If you are white and Irish, you're not on the same level, perceived on the same level with white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or white and Italian. So there's a hierarchy even among whites. So it doesn't surprise me that we have these racial hierarchies that organize our lives and throughout society. I think there's a commitment to dualistic thinking within the context of whiteness, so that we live in what Cory Booker refers to as the tyranny of the or what I've mentioned in one of my articles about the orbit of the or. We're constantly into either or. I'm either a bad person or a good person. I'm not a racist because I'm a good person. That we seem to be unable in a context of whiteness to hold complexity, that one can be a good person and still have racist ideas. Stoicism, this never let them see you sweat mentality, the ways in which is part of the reason why people of color are constantly surveilled for their affect. It's why my parents told me about the bass in my voice or not showing any emotion. There's a tendency to place product over process. So if it works for the product, the hell with the process. Well, I'm not so sure that has a place in a multiracial workplace. There's a value attached to intellectualism, so much so that no one, think about this, no one ever apologizes for being highly intellectual. But I've been spaces daily where people apologize for crying. Oh, I'm so sorry. I just tend to be emotional. I'm so sorry. We feel like we have to apologize for our emotion. No one ever says, I'm sorry, you know what? I'm just like stuck in my head. I just can't. I'm just a very cognitive person. I can't find a feeling even if I Google it. No one ever says that because we value intellectualism. Objectivity. That whiteness promulgates objectivity. And it just so happens that white people are the rule makers, the rule interpreters, and the rule enforcers, all under the guise of what's objective. And so I think that we have to critique whiteness and the ways in which the ideology pervades our lives and our workspaces if we ever want to be able to uplift the issues of racial equity within our institutions and within our hearts. So I'm going to stop here, and I just want to say that I think that each of us must decide minimally three things. One is, are the current activities in which we're engaged in, do they constitute our work or our jobs? I think our job is where we show up every day, back when we could show up every day, where we have some sense of dwindling benefits attached to those. Our work is what we do on behalf of the planet. It's what we do on behalf of humanity. It is born out of our commitment and our resolve to leave the world a little bit better place it was than we inherited it. Some of us are lucky that our job and our work are seamlessly integrated. But for some of us, that's not the case. So I think it's also important for us to ask ourselves, is what I'm doing a calling that has delivered and driven me to a career? Or is this a career that's disguised as a calling? No one can answer that question for us. We have to answer those questions for ourselves. And then finally, I think each of us has to ask ourselves, who is it and how is it that we wish to be? I think that those of us who are imbued with power and privilege in the context of the work we have minimally three options available to us that we can choose from. We can choose to be helper, healer, or jailer. The helper is the person who's always there to pick up the pieces when parts of the human condition become fragmented, broken, or shattered. The helper is always there to pick it up when things fall apart, and goodness knows things do often fall apart. So we need helpers. But what the helper doesn't do is take on systems of domination to prevent the very fracturing that happens. Responds after the crisis, doesn't do very much to thwart the crisis. And then there's a jailer. The jailer is the type of person or persons who are committed to the prevailing order. The jailer, the familiar refrain of the jailer is, look, I don't make the rules, I'm just trying to do my job. Even when they recognize that just doing your job may not be enough. But the jailer just perpetuates the status quo. And then there's the healer. And the healer recognizes that the work we're in, that involves at the center of it, the human condition, that the healers have to be the manufacturers of hope. The healers recognize that the business we're really in is the hope manufacturing business, where we're endeavoring to hold hope in places where hope has long since ceased to exist. That the healer never would acknowledge that the way it is the way it has to be. That the healer believes that the impossible is possible, though it may in fact take a while. It's your choice. It's your decision. My hope is that every single one of us on this platform today would strive to be healers. Because given where we are in our world today, we need healers. Thank you very much. I appreciate you listening. I'm going to toss this back over to Mark. Mark, I can't hear you. I can't hear Mark. Okay. So I appreciate everyone listening, and once we get the audio squared away and create some space for Q&A, I would very much love to get your thoughts and reflections. I want to say to you that before this happens, that and I'm being totally honest with each of you here, I am so absolutely desperate for us to be able to have meaningful conversations in our society about race, that I'm willing to suspend all rules of civility. So please, when we open this up and we're interacting, please don't feel like you have to be polite. You don't have to choose your words carefully. I would encourage you to just give it to me straight with no chaser. Mark, turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Ken. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me, Ken?
I sure can. Yes, I can.
Great, good.
Yes.
So I would just like to start with a question going back to the three versions of how to approach this work: the healer, the jailer, the helper. And Ken, I know this work you've been engaged in this for most of your career. You've seen hope dashed. You come up against institutional barriers and reticence and the enduring complexity of white supremacy and white fragility. As a healer, what would be your advice to other people who want to be healers, and how to think about being a healer for the long term, of riding through the way in which this work undulates, hopefully getting to somewhere that's progress, but it has its backwards and forwards movements? What would be your advice to people who want to be healers in this work?
Well, thanks, Mark, for the question. I think it's a great question. And my thought is that one of the key aspects of an aspiring healer, because I don't know that any of us ever reach that sacred place, is that there's that there's a belief in hope, and that the profession that we're really in is the hope manufacturing profession. And so that the healer, I think it's important that even when in those most despairing, pessimistic moments, to hold on to some kernel of hope and to keep plowing forward. I think that's so important to do. And the second is that I believe that we are a relational being. We are relational people. And that we live our lives in a relational context. And I think when we stay in relationships, we have a commitment to stay in relationships, that holds the greatest possibility for transformation. So one of the things I have to constantly ask myself when I'm in very complicated exchanges with someone or a system, and I'm feeling frustrated, a little voice in my head comes up and says, Ken, what is more important to you now, to be right or to be in relationship? If I choose that it's right, it's more important to be right, then I proceed with reckless abandon. I'm out to destroy the other person. If I default to relationships, then I tap into a deeper sense of humility, hope, all those things that will keep possibilities possible. And I think that the healer has to actually internalize and imbue those traits.
Ken, as seen through the rubric of mental health, addressing racism requires both an individual clinical and a population perspective. Anti-racial activism is therapeutic as well as a social justice practice. Speaking for myself personally, probably the most searing insight about the burden of racism among Black people I have read of or heard of were remarks you made speaking at the engagement that we were both at in Bermuda. And you talked about the unfathomable burden of having to think and carry a constant awareness of not saying or doing something that might activate a white person's reaction. Your remarks elucidated the persistent self-monitoring and self-censoring that takes a person away from their own experience or being in touch with their own body or emotions in order to take care of white people. And you didn't talk much about this, but I think this is a key thing of if I go back to your last comment of being a healer and being in relationship, for white people, they need to understand this burden that gets put on people of color. And what is it that you'd want us to know more about that as a part of being in that relationship where people of color are asked to self-monitor just so systematically? I'm sorry, Ken is frozen. We're going to... Sure. So we're waiting for Ken. I'm sorry, it froze temporarily. We're all familiar with being in Zoom world, so I apologize. Ken's back.
Yeah.
So Ken, I don't know if you're able to hear me, but I talked about... okay, great.
Yeah,
you can
and
hear me. Okay.
Please go.
No, you go. I'm sorry. It sounds like you heard the whole question.
I didn't hear the whole question, but I was thinking that you were referring to this, the term I often use is the kind of surveillance that people of color are always under, the gaze of white people. And it's one thing to be under surveillance, but then to have it impact your every movement, what you say, what you don't say. And it's a level, it's one of the things that makes parenting children of color, and Black children in particular, so incredibly difficult, because it's hard to tell your children how fast walking is too fast. That if you walk too slow, there's a point where it's too slow, you seem suspicious. If you walking fast, you seem suspicious. If you look the other way, it's constantly having to live with the anxiety of all this on a day-to-day basis. And what I believe is that until we look at the racial dimensions of these issues, that there's an aspect of health disparities that we'll never completely understand. Because I think it's the human body, I'm not a physician, but the human body was not built or equipped to carry the kind of toxicity that living in a white-dominated, racially oblivious world creates for people of color. And that burden is not a burden that's shared. It's a burden that is carried rather exclusively on the shoulders and backs of people of color.
Ken, you've done a lot of work with health departments in academic settings and large institutions, and you've seen a variety of efforts to address structural racism in mental health. What are the characteristics of communities and organizations that do this well, and what would your advice be to this audience?
Well, I think that one of the characteristics is I think that it requires leadership at the top to develop, I think there are two critical relational muscles that really underpin all this work. And that's what I refer to as an intensity muscle, which is having a capacity to tolerate discomfort. And the other is an intimacy muscle, which is a capacity to tolerate vulnerability. And when we can't tolerate intensity and vulnerability at any level of leadership, it sets the tone throughout the organization, because I think in this sort of, United Statesian way, we want everything. We want to have a peaceful coexistence without justice. We want racial transformation with comfort. I don't know how we can take on the issue of race and have that be a comfortable endeavor. It is fraught with discomfort. It is fraught with complexities. And I think having the capacity and the willingness to hold and navigate all of that, I think is critical for systemic change. It happens typically if a white people, once there's any modicum of discomfort that's felt and then expressed as a lack of safety, that it is very difficult to move forward with these initiatives.
Thank you. I think to really understand how we can address racism and mental health, it's important to understand the whole notion of intergenerational trauma. And we know that there's a dimension of mental health conditions that can be both transmitted genetically as well as behaviorally. What are the kinds of interventions or thinking we need to embrace to get really our arms around this intergenerational trauma issue that's cumulative and that has this long-term residual effect?
Well, Mark, as you well know, I live in New York City, and right after 9/11, the terrorist attack here, and maybe it's the same thing in the Bay Area as well, that you will not get on a subway or bus or any of the area airports where you don't see this inundation of signs that says, if you see something, say something. And that was considered to be a kind of anti-terrorist slogan, if you will, saying that, look, own this problem. And whatever you see, however minuscule, if you see something, it's incumbent upon you to say something. Well, I think that same anti-terrorist message has to be applied to our work, because slavery was terrorism. And I think when I talked in the keynote about the importance of seeing, I think we all have to increase our visual acuity so that we can see these issues and all the multitudinous ways in which they play out. And then when we see something, we have to say something. That little where I told about my colleagues at that meeting, they saw what I saw. For whatever reason, they didn't say anything. And I think there's a distinction between being quiet and being silenced. People of color are silenced. Their voices are taken away. When white people like my colleagues witnessed what they witnessed and didn't say anything, they weren't silenced. They were quiet. And quiet is a choice. And so I think speaking up is important. I think clearing your eyes to see it and then being able to address it.
Thank you. Ken, you have a book coming out on May 17th, which I will add you shared as your mother's birthday, which is going to be a great birthday present to her.
Yes.
It's obviously focusing on the issue, the centrality, the ubiquitousness of whiteness. Can you give us a
Yes.
teaser of what we might find in your book?
Well, I think just expanding on how this ideology is not unlike democracy or patriarchy, any other ideology, and we're all born into it. And this notion that somehow that because I'm black or a person of color that I've escaped the ideology, but it lives large inside of me as well. And so the book is really trying to help all of us look at the ways in which it's deeply, seamlessly embedded in our institutions, in our psyche, how that affects race relationships, and if we want to move the needle, if we want to move forward in these issues, that is absolutely imperative that we interrogate it. The thing I'm most proud of the book is I reached out to a number of contributors who cover the racial hue to get input from them. And so it's not just Ken Hardy's black perspective, but there are some colleagues I have right there in the Bay Area from public health, from all walks of life, because I think that that's what is the kind of world I want to be in, where we recognize and honor multiple voices, multiple perspectives, and find a way to live together harmoniously. I know it sounds mamby-pamby, me or the world, but it's exactly what I believe.
Well, we look forward to reading more about that. We're now going to shift to questions that are coming in from the community. The first question is, how does the effects of racism, structural and systemic, impact the trust building among those in the same affinity group? For instance, Black people trusting other Black folks when conducting business, living as roommates, or just together with a common goal. We haven't talked about the way in which racism plays out within similar groups of people. Can you talk a bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a major issue, and I remember going to an organization, and the CEO was saying to me and said, I'm very proud to let you know that the racial issues we have here. I'm so delighted to say," she said, as a white CEO, they're not black and white issues. We don't have those. All of our issues are black and brown, black and black. I said
Mm,
to her that there are no black and black or black and brown issues that don't wear the fingertips of whiteness. Because the reason that what feeds and fuels within group tensions and lack of trust is this broader ideology of whiteness. And so we cannot live in a society that says that if you are Latinx or you're black and your skin is dark, that you're ugly and unattractive, and if you are light, that you are de facto smart and beautiful. You can't have those narratives permeate our lives and then have people within a group trust each other. That there's a process that is so widespread in predominantly white organizations. In my writings, I refer to it as the gemification process, a gem, GEMM. And GEM is an acronym for good, effective, mainstream minorities. And so there are that white institutional structures help to produce gems. And so that if you show up and you are non-threatening and that you disavow your racial self, you will much more likely be firmly embraced within that organization. You fit in the organization, but then what happens is that there's a lack of trust within your racial group. And so all these dynamics that play out at the microsystemic level are very much connected to larger systemic issues. And again, why I think we have to be able to see, because we can look at these issues and see it as a black on black, brown on brown, without seeing the broader implications of how those dynamics, those relationships are shaped profoundly by folks' relationship to whiteness.
A related question, Dr. Hardy. Once a child goes outside his or her door, the outside world is full of racial inequity, both socially and institutionally. How does one undo the lifelong indoctrination of being less than?
Boy, that's a great question. One of the more painful moments I have in my life is when I'm in spaces like this and face to face. And like what happened last week, there was a 71-year-old black woman who stood up, fighting back tears and saying, on the one hand, I've had a beautiful life And on the other hand, I've wasted my life. I've spent much of my life trying to find ways to love myself, to regain all the things that white supremacy took from me. I can
I can't
think
hear Ken.
I can think about the moments. Can you hear me, Mark? Can you hear me? No. Can anyone hear me? Okay. So part of what I was saying is that that this woman was trying to find ways to love herself because she'd been so deeply devalued. And so I just think that whether it's in the mental health setting, whether it's in parenting, school, other systems, that those of us, and I'm not just talking about black people, I'm talking about all of us, in working with people of color, have to commit ourselves to making sure that we're doing everything imaginable to counteract devaluation, because you will constantly live in a society where you're devalued. And so we have to point out the redeemable aspects of people, ensure that black and brown children learn to love themselves regardless of what their complexion is, regardless of what their hair texture, regardless of what their nose looks like or what their eyes look like. That if we don't comment on those things explicitly, then what we're doing is we're leaving our young people vulnerable to being indoctrinated by those things. And so I think that's so important. I think the question is such a wonderful question, a very timely question, because I think that is this issue of devaluation follows people of color across the life cycle. And that's what the Black Lives Matter, for example, movement was trying to counteract, to say, look, your life matter. Regardless of what the broader society around you communicates, your life is important. And so I think that we can't utter those types of affirming messages nearly enough, because the messages that that promote devaluation are consistent and persistent. We're always under those messages.
Ken, we're having technical difficulties, so I was not able to hear what you just said. I apologize. And
Okay.
I can't comment on what you said. So I'm going to move on to
Yeah,
another
that's fine.
question, which is, what are some examples of what a coworker can say to publicly support a person of color in a group setting? For example, a person of color board member is interrupted and dismissed routinely by the board president. How does one step in at that moment?
I love the question. I appreciate that questioner's spirit. I think that I know that often I hear from lots of white people that there's a worry about being the white savior. And so I think there's a fundamental difference between a white savior and a white ally. And so I think when you're in that board meeting and you hear that, I think that is a critical moment to become a white ally. And so here's the difference. I think the white savior is out to save individual people of color. We'll speak to that one issue. The white ally is a person who stands up for racial and social justice and takes a position against injustice. So I'm hoping that the person who watches that black board member being interrupted for the umpteenth time to say something to the effect, can we take a pause here for a moment? And if I'm white, I'm saying, as a white member of this board, I've noticed that we have a tendency to get so enthusiastic and involved in what we're doing that there's a tendency to cut off each other. And I noticed that, you know, we are particularly egregious at cutting off people of color. And I think that's inconsistent with what we're trying to become as an organization. And so I just want to ask, can we each make a pledge here to make sure that no one is interrupted when they're speaking, and particularly, the ways as we try to expand the inclusiveness of our organization. I think it's going to be really important for us to be more mindful of that. And so I think that's what it involves. It involves constructively engaging. It's calling attention to the systemic piece of it, I don't think it's appropriate to say, uh, did you just notice that that Ken here was speaking and got cut off again? Because it makes it about that black person that got cut off. I think the issue is much bigger than that black person that got cut off. That there's something about that board chair who's cutting off that black board member probably does that in other areas of his or her life as well. And so we're calling attention to how this it's what I refer to one of my writings as privilege interruptus, where one has the privilege feel like one has the privilege to interrupt. I think it has to be called out and attached to this larger notion of whiteness and white supremacy.
Dr. Hardy, this is our last question. Could you please say more about how to develop a deeper sense of humility, and what are some ways to practice it in the open?
Well, I think that part of the work that each of us has to do is that we have to develop a multidimensional view of the self. So this is more of this internal work. And this multidimensional view of the self means that I no longer see myself as a singular self, but multiple selves. In fact, I feel so strongly about this. If I had the power to change our language system, I would get rid of the word like myself and yourself. And I would speak rather in terms of myself and yourselves. So let me give you an example. So I have a multitude of selves. I have a black self. I have a class self, a religious self, an able-bodied self, a cisgender self, a multitude of selves. I need to get in touch with all of my selves. And all of those selves I have, the selves that we have some selves that are privileged and some that are subjugated. So the white gay man has a privileged white self, a privileged male self, and a subjugated gay self. It's when we look at the world through the prism of our subjugation is where we develop empathy and humility for others. So that it means that I don't have to be black to know what it's like to be as a Jewish person. I don't have to be black to know what it's like to be demeaned and disrespected. I don't have to be woman to know what it's like to be affixed with a marginalized status, to be ignored, overlooked, stepped on, and stepped over. But if I haven't developed an intimate relationship with my subjugated self, then I don't have those experiences to tap into that provide the seeds for my humility.
Right.
That's where I think the internal work is so important. And I think it's important for individuals and for institutions.
Yeah, Ken, I've never heard it described that way, and that makes such sense as a starting point for doing this work. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we've come to our end of our presentation, our discussion today, and I want to thank you, Dr. Kenneth Hardy, for sharing your wisdom and scholarship in this area. This is my third time working with you, Ken, and I'm always aware of the intense emotional resources that go on during this work and the demands of it on you as a speaker and what it requires you to cover to engage in this material. I want to thank you for your generosity of mind and heart that you are willing to share these learnings and your belief that good can come of it. As a part of the community, as a behavioral health provider, Caminar commits to deepening our work to becoming an anti-racist organization. Thank you for shedding light on this push forward, Ken.
My pleasure. Thanks for having
everyone.
me.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. I want to encourage you, if you think this work is important, to consider supporting our work with a contribution. This is our second Caminar Speaker Series, and we look forward to bringing more topics and thought leaders to our community to figure out how we together can create better mental well-being and health in our community. Thanks again for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.